So I was commissioned by ORA Singers to write a piece of music that was based on, or a reimagining of, Talas's O Lux, which is a beautiful hymn, a very short hymn, 2.5 or 3 minutes if you perform it really slowly, hymn of music. And it was a lovely thing to do actually, because my normal job is writing film music really. I'm a composer of film music and television drama. So still kind of word painting, storytelling, but not really doing that much choral work. But I started off my journey as a musician as singing in a choir when I was very young. And so it was a lovely thing to return to that. And actually the choir I sang in did an awful lot of this kind of music, Talas, Palestrina, Bird, Victoria, Renaissance polyphony basically. So it's a lovely thing to delve back into that world and be inspired by it and rediscover it and try and do something that's lived up to it in some way, and hopefully reconnected sort of new audiences with that music. So I found the text very inspiring for O Lux. I mean, I was very intrigued. I think this is such an interesting period, that Tudor period, musically. So to talk about music history for a second, I just found, when I started, I was contacted, we'd like you to do O Lux. Okay, I obviously knew the hymn a little bit, looked more into it, and I was struck by a couple of things instantly by it, that it's in Latin, yet it's in a sort of very simple Reformation style. Which essentially, at the time, I don't know how many people are aware of this who might be watching this, but at the time it's a very, very interesting time musically and history, politically. And I suppose at the time, those Tudor times, the church and state, because they're inextricably linked, the way in which a composer set words to music was massively, massively important politically. And if they did it wrong, they were in big trouble, because if they, for instance, set music that was too florid and not simple enough and in Latin at a particular time, a sort of 20 or 30 year period during the Reformation, they potentially could be seen as Catholic sympathisers, and it was a treasonable offence. I mean, there was seriously high stakes in those days. And then, of course, a few years later, it all changes back again, and you've got Counter-Reformation and Beauty. So I was very intrigued by this being a very simple hymn, but in Latin, which is a bit of a mashup, and I'm sure music historians have a particular word for this type of hymn. I wasn't, as a person who's about to create a piece of music, I wasn't really interested in the sort of terminology of that stuff. I was more focused on how the simplicity of it and the beauty of it, and the text. It's essentially a simple prayer to, when we all die, God, can you keep us with you? That's all it is, really. And it starts with a bit of fluffing up God, saying, light of light, inclined by love, you're very beautiful and fantastic. Inclined by love, I love that, sort of the idea of that. So I looked at the Latin text has 2 verses, and I sort of distilled that to what I thought was the essential essence, the meaning of it. And true to sort of Reformation kind of aesthetic and sentiment, I thought, let's try and create something equally very simple. And you look at the original, the Talas, it's almost one syllable to a note. So it's homophonic sort of music. There's a couple of very, very short looks. Actually, the word light in Latin has 2 notes to it, and that's about it. Everything else is just homophonic music. So I tried to keep something of that in it, so that it's very simple, and it really translates the text as clearly as possible. And I distilled the text. It's kind of almost like an Uber Reformation. I've turned it back into English, took only the salient parts of the text I thought really transmitted the message, and turned 2 verses into, I think it's just got, O light of light, inclined by love, hear this our prayer. So what is the prayer? And then a very simple line at the end, which is, keep us when our race is run, and that's it.
Keep us when our race is run. Keep us when our race is run.
From that, I then began to look more at the music and played an awful lot through as original, so that the harmonies and the particular motivic cells kind of became more and more sort of embedded. And then 2 or 3 things popped out at me, which I thought, well, let's try and take those. So the first one, obviously the very first phrase of the Tallis, the top line, the melody line, I suppose, is... So I've taken that line and over the "O light of light," "O light of light," basically, and then done 3 versions of that, kind of extending in sort of sumptuousness, I suppose. And then I noticed that Tallis allows himself 2 notes to 1 syllable on looks, so I thought, well, I'll allow myself to do some florid stuff with light, where the sopranos do the this florid light of light over the top. But then really the real sponge, that's just the sort of icing on top of the fairy cake, but the real sponge of the fairy cake is the tenors, altos and basses with this rising, what's that about, inclined by love, finishing with love at the end. And then it goes back very faithfully really to the Tallis, which is just this hymn, Hear This Our Prayer, which I thought, let's keep it very simple and almost all in unison. And then Keep Us When Our Race Is Run is very, very similar to the last line of the original, but obviously in English. So it's interesting. So in compositional, I suppose that's my sort of job as a film composer. It's not really, for me, it wasn't about sort of creating a piece of music that's really different and interesting and totally different from the original. And I actually really relished the opportunity to try and be very faithful and true to what I thought Tallis was doing at the time and see what refracted through my prism of musical experiences, how I could do something that was really honoured that piece of music. It was very simple, but translated the text to hopefully a new audience and connected with them in the same way that I imagine the original did at the time. So that was really my process, and that's what we ended up with. And then it was lovely to, then I turned up and heard them perform it, and it sounded way better than it really is, because they're such a brilliant choir. So that was good.